Welcome back. This time we're talking about Person of Interest, Season 5, Episode 12, .exe. Now this is ultimately the penultimate episode of Person of Interest, and what appears to be the first half of the series finale. As always, this is going to include spoilers for the entire episode as well as previous episodes, so if you haven't seen .exe, go see it, then come back and watch this. So this is a pretty action-filled episode with Finch infiltrating the NSA and discovering that it's actually the nexus of Samaritan operations. Meanwhile, John and Shaw listen to instructions from the machine, which ultimately lead them to the same location. And finally, we have Fosco in a pretty isolated storyline in which the FBI agent that had investigated him earlier this season returns, and we discover that he's actually a Samaritan agent. So like last episode, I kind of have mixed feelings about this one. There's some really good action, some good character moments, some good conversations between Finch and the machine. And obviously we've got this build up to the final episode. But unlike a lot of episodes this season, I had some issues. Some of it's nitpicks, some potential plot holes. And others, as I mentioned in my review of the previous episode, I'm not a big fan of this ICE-9 virus that has just sort of shown up and is apparently the weapon that's going to destroy Samaritan. So there are a few things I want to discuss about this episode. Let's just jump right into it. First off, we have Finch. I mentioned in my review for the previous episode, I didn't think that his kind of, they weren't playing it up as a heel turn, but him becoming this less moral protagonist, I didn't think they did a great job of illustrating that. This episode begins where we get to see Finch in a much more assured version of this more amoral character as he's dealing with this apparent traitor to the country who had sold secrets, and how he just basically cows this guy by threatening to reveal his secrets. And I did enjoy Finch as a character in this episode. I enjoyed seeing this darker side to him and more self-assured. The Finch that we met in Season 1 would not have been able to infiltrate the NSA, pretend to be someone's driver, shoot him with a tranquilizer dart, then bluff his way through several layers of security, and then talk down Greer in a one-on-one conversation. So it really does go to show the growth of the character. So it's not quite the payoff that we were promised 2 episodes ago. It is an improvement over what we got last episode. So let's talk about the ICE-9 virus. This, again, is something I'm not a fan of. They're going to have to sell me very hard in this last episode, and the writers have done a good job of proving me wrong many times before, so I'm willing and able to admit that if they do so after next episode. And as I've said before, I really hope so. I love this show. I want it to go out on a high note. I'm just not a fan of this virus as a plot development. I think it came out of nowhere, and I still don't understand why Samaritan didn't destroy it when it had a chance. It's not a huge secret. The guy that Finch breaks into his house at the beginning of the episode recognizes the ICE-9 virus by seeing a few lines of code on a computer screen from 10 feet away. So this is not something that wasn't just well known and that the machine just suddenly said, "Oh, by the way, there's this virus, go get it." But I don't really get it. Why did Samaritan not destroy it? I mean, he killed a radio disc jockey because he was asking questions about its communication system. It's not going to destroy a virus that apparently can and will destroy it. As we find out in this episode, they're basically running the NSA. I mean, literally the top office is Greer and Samaritan. So how did Samaritan not know about this virus and not have access to destroy it? I'm not getting that right now. But it's not all negativity for me. Come on now. So I will say, I do like the moral quandary that they set up with the fact that this will kill Samaritan, but it's also going to destroy the machine. And will Finch do that? Will he sacrifice the machine and the good that it can do for the world to stop Samaritan? I mentioned in my review for the last episode about this conversation between Finch and the machine about the collateral damage, and I said then that they're really going to have to prove to me that the collateral damage was going to be very significant to get me to buy the moral quandary. Well, consider me buying the moral quandary. Not only would it destroy the machine, but all of the good that it could potentially do, as well as essentially Finch being forced to kill his child. I mean, yes, they proved that point. And I will say the script for this episode does a really good job of keeping us guessing on whether or not Finch is actually going to activate the virus. There's several points in this episode where it almost feels like it could be a red herring, and that it's either the story is going to go in a different direction, or it was Finch's plan all along to scare Samaritan with this virus and then go in a different direction. Obviously that's not where they ultimately go, because Finch activates the virus, and that's kind of our cliffhanger for this episode. But I wasn't sure at several points in this episode, especially when the machine tells Finch that John and Shaw are in trouble, and to go rescue them might cost them their last chance to activate the virus. And I might be going out on a little bit of a limb here, but I don't think the machine wants the virus activated. Obviously, it means its death. At least that's what the implication is at this point. But you can kind of feel it in that same scene when it almost feels like the machine is kind of guilt-tripping Finch into, well, you could activate the virus, and John and Shaw are going to die, or you could go save your friends, which is basically what you've been trying to do for the last several episodes. There's a little bit of subtle manipulation there on the side of the machine. At least that's the way I read it. And ultimately, he gets the best of both worlds, because he gets to save John and Shaw, and he still gets to activate the virus. So the other major development in this episode was the death of Greer, who has pretty much been our primary villain, or at least the face of our villain, through Samaritan, since the last arc of Season 3. And here he dies in an attempt to kill Finch after proving that the machine didn't know what the password was to activate the virus. Even though we found out later, even though Finch didn't tell the machine what the password was, the machine had already deduced it because it knows Finch so well. So like a lot of things in this episode, I'm of two minds. One, it is a great illustration that Greer has completely given up his own free will to Samaritan's will. Not only is he completely willing to die for Samaritan, apparently he died for no reason in this episode. From Greer's point of view, that's all I can think of, because there's so many ways he could have killed Finch in this scene that didn't involve him locking himself in a room that had all the oxygen getting sucked out of it. I mean, Finch has a limp. It's one of his most obvious physical character traits in this series from the first episode. I'm pretty sure he could outrun him to the door, close the door, and watch him die. Or he could have shot him. I mean, it really seems like Samaritan runs this building. I think he could have gotten away with shooting somebody, especially if they were making it look like Finch was breaking in, which he did. So I just don't understand why Greer had to die. Now, from Samaritan's point of view, it could have been another test, or it could just be that he felt that Greer had outlived his usefulness and was tired of hearing him drone on and on like he's apt to do. I don't know, but it doesn't really make sense. Like I said, it's a good illustration of Greer's point of view on how he has submitted his will entirely to Samaritan, which is the antithesis of what the machine is advocating in this episode, where he's allowing Finch to make the decision on whether or not to unleash the virus, even though the machine knows that apparently it will result in its own death as well. But from a practical standpoint, it makes no sense. And on a side note of things that just don't really make sense in this episode when it comes to Samaritan and its agents and this NSA building. At the end, when John and Shaw are able to escape, Finch is going off on his own little mission, and there's this bomb threat, and everyone's running away. I mean, Finch passes like 4 people. Obviously, they weren't Samaritan agents, but there are obviously a large number of Samaritan agents in this building, I would imagine. Why do they leave because of a bomb threat? Samaritan can talk to them all directly, can tell them this is fake, go kill Finch before he activates this virus that's going to destroy your Supreme Leader. Why do they all leave? How did Finch get to the command center unaccosted, activate the machine, and presumably escape? It's kind of a little plot hole nitpick, but it's those nitpicks that I don't normally have, especially this season. I mean, I've looked for them. There was a number of times where it felt like I should nitpick something here or there, and most of the time it turned out that those problems were because we were watching a Shaw simulation. But this was like a glaring issue for me as far as a plot hole, and it's not something I usually can pick out in a good person of interest episode, so I'm going to mention it now. I hate that I was insanely positive for the first 10 episodes, and I've been kind of negative on these last 2 episodes, but you know, these are the final episodes. They need to be great, and they've been good. But I'm having problems, and they're problems I wasn't having in earlier episodes. So enough on that. Let's move on to the next point. Briefly, Fosco, he's got this kind of isolated storyline back in New York City, in which the body dump that he discovered a number of episodes back has been found. And the FBI agent who had come in to pretty much squash the investigation into Elias's death returns, and then ultimately it turns out that he's a Samaritan agent. And at the end, Fosco is able to once again get control of the situation, and we're left with a secondary cliffhanger here on what is Fosco going to do. He can't just let him go, but he's also not at the point where he used to be as a crooked cop, where he's just willing to just shoot him in the head and let him float away. So where that's going, I'm going to assume that that's going to somehow tie in more directly to our main storyline. I don't feel that Fosco deserves to be completely shifted off to the side for the last 2 episodes of the series, but we'll just have to wait and see. So as I said, there were some really good conversations between the Machine and Finch in this episode, and a lot of it had to revolve around the sort of It's a Wonderful Life motif, in that we got to see simulations on what would have happened to our main characters if the Machine had never existed. It's a pretty popular trope for finales. I think the most obvious one I can think of would be the old Highlander series. I mean, that was a straight up It's a Wonderful Life ripoff episode to finish the series. This was a bit more, I wouldn't say subtle, but it was more of a secondary plot to the main one. It was sort of to inform Finch's decision to activate the virus that would ultimately kill the Machine. And as far as our characters go, seeing what would have happened to them if the Machine had never existed was a pretty mixed bag. Finch is not in hiding and not being shot at, not having to fight a war against an omnipotent being, at least not yet, because in this timeline he wouldn't know about Samaritan, but I would imagine sooner or later he'd find out about it. It'd be interesting to see what would happen in that timeline. I'm guessing it would be much too late to really do much, but I think he would end up being in some kind of fight sooner or later. But as we're seeing, he doesn't have a limp. He doesn't really have a purpose. His purpose is basically to work and make him and Nathan money. Speaking of Nathan, he's alive and happy and rich, so that's sort of that's a definite improvement over reality. Speaking of being alive, so is Carter. She's gotten a promotion and seems to be having a pretty good life, although the Machine does allude that not everything is as it seems. I would still say a net positive with a implication of bad things to come. As far as bad things go, Fosco, he's a drunk, disgraced cop, and kind of a loser, it seems. So net negative. John, also well, he's dead. He's pretty much the only character who would have died, at least to this point, without the machine and Finch giving him a purpose in his life. Although his almost wife would be alive. Shaw is still a government agent, unwittingly doing the bidding of Samaritan, although her partner's still asking a few too many questions, so it would have been interesting to see where that would have led. And then we have Root, who would be alive and worshipping a omnipotent artificial intelligence, but in this case it would be Samaritan, leading her down an even darker path than she was on prior to encountering the machine. And finally, we have the world at large, which looks to be almost entirely under the heel of Samaritan, without the machine there to fight back. So I thought they did a good job of sort of showing the mix, some positive, some negative, but in this case, they only kind of allude to the numbers, the many numbers that our team has saved over these seasons. We see the guy, and I can't remember his name, who was sort of the whistleblower that they were able to save at the last minute. In this version, we see him getting killed by Shaw. So it's an interesting way of just looking at the differences on is there a true net positive, because as we see, Samaritan still became Samaritan even without the machine. If nothing else, Finch doesn't have to have that on his conscience. But as he points out, the question at this point is not really about whether he should have created the machine at all. That genie's out of the bottle. The question is now, is killing the machine an acceptable loss to end Samaritan? And if there is no other way, I mean, that is a question, and it's a question that I can see both sides on. And that's what makes it a compelling question as we reach this final episode, even though I'm not a huge fan of the virus plot device itself. It does result in an interesting two-sided question. I will say I have been a bit negative on a number of things in this episode, but as an episode at large, it is an enjoyable episode. There is some good action. I love the scene in which Finch, apparently listening to the machine's warning, shouts to John 6 o'clock. It was just sort of a new version on the God mode there. So overall, this has been a solid final season. I do have some complaints about these last two episodes. And as I said in my review for the last episode, I have to wait to see how this all plays out. They could tie everything up in a way that makes all of these new plot devices work and work well, and I really don't have any solid reason to think they're not going to, because of their track record through now almost full 5 seasons. So we have less than a week to go now. I do hope that we get a great finale. I've loved this show from the first episode. I've watched every episode since. I'm really going to miss it when it's gone. This is going to be a show that I'm definitely going to miss when it's no longer on air. So without getting completely melancholy here, let me end it. Let me know what you thought about this episode. If you thought the negatives I pointed out were really negatives, or if you don't agree with me, let me know. If you have any other ideas on how this could play out in the final episode, definitely comment. As always, you can subscribe to my channel, check out some of my other reviews, and for one last time, until next time, watch out for Samaritan.